The traveler at this point is really regretting that he picked up this particular hitchhiker. And eventually he kind of confronts him and says, you know, I find it really hard to believe that people in your town are coming up out of their graves. The hitchhiker then says to the traveler, why? What do you think happens to people when they die? And at this point, the story takes a bit of a philosophical turn. And after a bit of a conversation, the traveler admits that, well, I guess I always sort of believed, without even really thinking about it, that when people die, if they've done good things in their life, that they would be rewarded, and if they've done bad things during their life, that they would be punished. The hitchhiker says, okay, well, that's a fairly common belief. But what about people who never did anything good or bad during their lives? People who never made a choice, whether for good or for evil, people who never made any kind of commitment, someone whose life wasn't really their own, someone whose life wasn't really a life. And then he says, no one in our town has ever really died, because no one in our town has ever really lived. So that is the story of the dead town. The last story I want to mention by the 20th century Yiddish writer Itzik Monger, who actually died in 1969 in Israel. This was a story called My Last Day in Paradise. It's actually the first chapter of a novel called The Book of Paradise. And I mentioned before that these writers, even when writing secular works, are always drawing on ancient religious sources. And this is a story, Monger's story has its origins in the Talmud, in this compendium of Jewish law and legend that grows up out of commentaries about the Hebrew Bible. And the story that he tells goes like this. The story in the Talmud goes like this. It says that before we're born, we're taught all of the secrets of the universe. And in fact, what it says that we're taught all the secrets of the Torah being the first 5 books of Moses. But what's meant by that in Jewish tradition is not just the content of these 5 books of Moses, but rather the secrets of an entire ethical way of life. So before we're born, while we're in utero, we're taught all of these secrets. But then just before we're born, an angel puts a finger to our lips. And this is why we have this dent below our nose. And there's actually a more violent version of the story where the angel actually smacks us across the face. And that's why we have this dent below our nose. And at that point, the angel says, shh, don't tell these secrets. And at that point, we forget all of these things we were supposed to have learned. And then after we're born, we have to spend the rest of our lives trying to remember these things that we've forgotten. In Monger's version, the story starts in paradise with a character named Sammy, who's a boy who, living in paradise, enjoying his time in paradise, as presumably most people do. And the way the story starts, it says he's sitting under a paradise tree, listening to the paradise canaries, and he would describe to you what their music sounds like, but since you're not living in paradise, you really wouldn't be able to appreciate it. So he starts the story this way, and then Sammy has a friend comes up to him and says, Sammy, I've got bad news for you. Sammy says, well, I mean, we're in paradise. I mean, how bad can it possibly be? Whatever it is, I'm sure we can fix it. His friend says to him, no, Sammy, it's really bad news. You're going to be born. Sammy is, of course, extremely distraught at hearing this news. And one of the things that most distresses him is that he realizes that he's going to be smacked on the face, and then he's going to forget everything that happened to him in paradise, including his friendship with this little boy. So he and his friend quickly develop a plan. And what they realize is that the angel who has been assigned to smack Sammy across the face happens to conveniently be a notorious drunk. So they take this angel to one of the great bars of paradise, and they get him completely wasted, as people of my generation would say. And in the process of this, while they're getting him completely drunk, they put a piece of clay over Sammy's nose and mouth. So when this angel then hits Sammy across the face, he barely makes a dent in Sammy's face. He only dents the clay. And so at that point, Sammy is born, and he becomes the only person who's ever lived to remember all the things that the rest of us have forgotten from our life before birth in paradise. Now, I think when you look at all of these stories, you see that they're quite different in tone from each other. They're quite different in the way they're written, and in the style, and in the scope. All of them have a supernatural element, perhaps, and I want to say that that's certainly not everything in Yiddish literature has that element, although I emphasized it in this book. But as you see, the stories are all very different, but they all do have something in common, which I think is a common theme in Jewish literature, and perhaps also a common theme throughout world literature, which is that all of these stories are in one way or another about confronting loss. In the first story, The Man Who Slept Through the End of the World, loss is played for laughs. In the second story, The Dead Town, loss is played for morality. In the third story, My Last Day in Paradise, loss is played for this sort of naivete that we don't even appreciate with the things that we've lost. And I think that what we see in this is that that all these stories, in effect, are asking the same question, which is that when everything we know of the world has disappeared, then what? What is left of us, of who we are? What do we still retain of the people who made us who we are? And what do we pass down to the people who will come after us? And those are some of the questions that I tried to explore in writing this book. I think it's obvious that I've attempted in some ways in writing this book to achieve a kind of revival of the dead by incorporating these works and many other works of Yiddish literature into this modern novel in English for readers who wouldn't understand Yiddish. But what I want to emphasize is that the attempt to revive the dead has been in some ways at the heart of Jewish literature since the time of the Bible, since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE. You have continuously an attempt to recreate the world through literature and to rebuild the world through literature. This attempt, in a sense, through words to revive the dead is both a national and a personal experience. And I have to say that it almost always fails. But it is in this failed attempt to revive the dead that something totally new can be born. I think the question of what's worth saving, of what elements of our life we decide to keep from one generation to another, is ultimately what determines what paintings hang in museums versus what paintings end up at yard sales. I used to live in Boston at one point, and when I lived there's a museum outside of Boston called the MoBA, which stands for the Museum of Bad Art. And this is actually, and you can imagine what kind of works hang in this museum. But one interesting thing about this museum is that they have a guest book for visitors leaving the museum. And one thing that people always write in the guest book, oh, I had a great time here, it was so funny. And then they always tend to say, but there's one work of art that does not belong in this museum. What's interesting is that no one ever mentions the same work of art twice. But I think that while this question of what's worth saving determines what paintings belong in the MoMA versus the MoBA, I think it also determines a lot of what our own lives look like, our private lives. I think we believe that secretly that there's some vast cultural choice that people like the Deschutes County Library, there's some celestial Deschutes County Library somewhere that's deciding that this book is going to be chosen for a novel idea for the next century, and it will become a part of the literary canon, and everyone will cherish it forever. But in fact, I think that these choices begin as very personal ones. When we each privately decide what in our lives is worth keeping, and it's only those things that we choose to keep that are allowed to extend across generations and survive us. I think that's true for works of art and for literature, but I think it's also true of every element of our private lives. And what I mean by that is not only sort of physical things, that heirlooms and things like that we carry down from our families in actual physical objects, but smaller things like our value, smaller things like the way that we speak, our mannerisms, the expressions that we use, the habits that we have, and more important things, of course, also like our beliefs and our values. And it's this choice of what's worth saving from the people who came before us that ultimately connects us to the people who are our peers in the generation in which we live, and in a sense, our peers on Earth who are alive at the same time as we are. And it's this choice of what's worth saving also that becomes eventually the only link between the living and the dead. My novel begins as an art heist, but at the end of the story, the mystery takes you to an imagined place between generations, where those who have died meet those who haven't yet been born. The title of the book is The World to Come, not referring just to life after death, but rather to life before birth, where regret is replaced by possibility. And I want to say that this is an idea that I've taken from various elements of the Jewish tradition, although it nowhere appears in quite the form that I present it in the book. Traditionally in Judaism, the expression "the world to come" means something very particular. It means a messianic age, an idea that the Messiah will come and the end of days will arrive. And at that point, the Messiah will revive the dead, and all of the dead will come up out of their graves and return to Jerusalem. So this is a very, very particular and very national idea in Judaism of the world to come. And in fact, this is, in effect, the idea of the afterlife in the world to come. You don't have an idea like you have in Christianity of sort of heaven and hell. Instead, you have an idea of whether or not one will merit a place in the world to come. And that's why there's the idea that the world to come is in effect the Jewish afterlife, is because the Jewish afterlife is believed to come at the end of days with the Messianic age. So this is a traditional idea. And what's interesting, actually, is this traditional idea evolves in post-biblical Judaism, because in the Hebrew Bible, there's no mention at all of an afterlife. The closest you have is the story in Ezekiel, where Ezekiel has a vision of a valley of dry bones. And in that valley of dry bones, he's told by God to prophesy to these bones. And then when he speaks to these bones, the bones rise up and they grow flesh again, and then they live again. And that's the closest thing you have in the Hebrew Bible to an idea of a revival of the dead. But so I took this idea of the world to come as being a kind of cosmic afterlife. But there's also another idea in Judaism of what are called gute betters, which is a Yiddish expression meaning good interceders. And this idea is that if one lives a meritorious life, that one then has the right in the future to intercede with God on behalf of one's descendants. So in a sense, and then of course there's the story from the Talmud that I mentioned before about all of the secrets that one is taught before one is born. So in a sense, I conflated all of these ideas together to create that final chapter in the novel, where you have a world to come where those who have died are, in fact, giving all of their traits and all of their values to those who haven't yet been born. But in some sense, I think it's also something that's a modern idea, because it comes from the idea of genetic inheritance. In fact, we are all made out of all the people who came before us. There is such a thing, a physical real thing of the revival of the dead, which is that every element of everyone who came before us lives within us. When I was finishing this book, I was expecting my first child, and I began thinking a lot about this legend that I mentioned about the child, what the child learns before he or she is born. Of course, after my daughter was born, I discovered that the secrets that babies have really forgotten are the secrets of how to sleep through the night, how to digest food. I mean, these are the things that you really wish the kid had remembered. But this is a novel about the power of the possible, about being able to see the world not only for what it is, but for what it could be. And ultimately, the story, I think, and those of you who have read it, I think will agree, is a story about inheritance. It's a story about what we inherit from our parents and our grandparents and from those who came before them, what we pass on to our children. And it sounds like a sort of a cultural or a national story, but in fact, it begins, as all stories do, as a very personal story about parents and children, what we get from our parents, whether we can choose what we inherit from our parents or not, what we pass down to our children, whether or not we can choose those things, whether we even want to choose those things. There is a moment that has happened over and over again, in every place that children have ever slept, on every dark night for the past 10,000 years, that almost everyone who was once a child will forever remember. It happens when you're being tucked into bed, on a dark and frightening night, when the sounds of the nighttime outside are drowned out only by the far more frightening sounds in your head. You have already gone to bed, have tried to go to bed, but because of whatever sounds you hear in your head, you have failed to go to bed. And someone much older than you, someone so old that you cannot imagine yourself ever becoming that old, has come to sit beside you and make sure that you fall asleep. But the moment that everyone who was once a child will remember is not the story that the unfathomably old person tells you, or the lullaby that he sings for you, but rather the moment right after the story or song has ended. You are lying there with your eyes closed, not sleeping just yet, but noticing that the sounds inside your head seem to have vanished, and you know, through closed eyes, that the person beside you thinks that you are asleep and is simply watching you. In that fraction of an instant between when that person stops singing and when that person decides to rise from the bed and disappear, a tiny rehearsal, though you do not yet know it, of what will eventually happen for good. Time holds still, and you can feel, through your closed eyes, how that person, watching your still, small face in the darkness, has suddenly realized that you are the reason his life matters. Thank you very much.